Okay, we're going to start this panel. Right now there are three of us. There may be a fourth person. Let's just call him a surprise guest if he shows up. Just to start off, so China is a key part of our innovation and production ecosystem, whether we like it or not. But over the past few years, we've seen efforts to remove equipment from Western networks manufactured by Chinese companies like Huawei and ZTE because of security concerns. We've engaged in trade fights, and there's talk of reworking supply chains to be less reliant on China. But what are the implications for China and the West of decoupling, which is a little bit of jargon that we'll actually talk about, try to define. And how do we explain the recent phenomenon of China turning against its own tech companies, and what does all this mean for the future of scientific collaboration and more? So let me quickly introduce our panelists, and then we'll start. To my left, we have Xiaomeng Liu, who is a senior analyst in Eurasia's Geo-technology practice, where she focuses on the interactions of emerging technologies with geopolitics, market dynamics, and regulatory norms. Before joining the Eurasia group, she was the China practice lead at the consulting firm Access Partnership, where she helped financial and cloud service providers in the US enter China's market. To Xiaomeng's left is Ambassador David Gross, who co-chairs the telecom, media, and technology practice at Wiley. He is widely recognized as one of the world's foremost experts on international telecommunications and internet policies, having addressed the United Nations General Assembly and led more U.S. delegations to major international.
They don't have to hear all this.
Okay.
They really don't.
Okay, so the one thing that I will say though is that in past years we've had the honor of David moderating panels, and this year we get to hear what he thinks. And so,
we'll see if you really like that or not. We'll find out.
And then on Zoom we have Samm Sachs, who is a senior fellow at Yale Law School, the Paul Tsai China Center and Cyber Policy Fellow at the New America Foundation. And her research focuses on emerging information and communication technology policies globally, particularly in China. She's worked on Chinese technology policy issues for over a decade, both with the US government and in the private sector. And if a fourth person joins, we will introduce him as well. But so let's start with kind of what's been going on recently. We've talked, there's a lot of talk about big tech here in the US, and we know that there are sort of analogous big tech companies in China. But all of a sudden, China seems to be turning against its own companies. What is going on? What explains this? And what does it mean for us? Who would like to start?
Sam wants to start.
I want my friend Xiaomeng to start. And it's such an honor to be on this panel with you guys. I wish I could be there in Aspen to do this in person next year. But I want to hear from Xiaomeng first.
Okay. The box stops here.
It starts there.
Yeah, so I will try to overgeneralize the situation and say Chinese government's general intention is to align major Chinese tech companies' business strategy with their political agenda. Over the past 20 years, a lot of these big tech companies have been operating in a very under-regulated environment. My analogy to this is you release an animal to the wild for 15, 20 years, and they behave like that for quite a while, and they kind of grow their own personality and have their own practice in this very relaxed regulatory environment. But now Chinese government realized that this firm has generated a lot of negative social impact. I think yesterday's panel on antitrust highlights some of the similar regulatory concern, whether that's privacy, cybersecurity, big tech, their size, their concentration, their labor standard. All these things exist in China, I would say to a certain extent at a higher level. So now Chinese government is trying to rein them back. They try to domesticate this wild animal by give them little lessons, a little bit slap on the wrist here, a little bit maybe a punch in the face in the ant case, also as a DD debacle in order to reshape their role in the economy. But the bottom line is that they're not trying to break them up. They're not trying to fully nationalize them. They don't want to kill their golden goose. I will leave it with that.
So do you think, I mean, in the US at least, they took their huge stock market hits. Was that an overreaction, or was that sort of an appropriate reflection of the punch in the face?
I think depends on what type of investor you are. I think that was within a week or two, there was $1 trillion value loss for China concept stocks in New York. And part of that is the market nerve breakdown due to the combination of the Didi debacle as well as the big restriction announcement of tutoring company that without much of a due process or consultation process in China, that was a big surprise to investors. These two things combined together, people think, what are they doing? Why they are targeting this very wide spectrum of private company in China, and we didn't get any notice who is going to be next. That's why there's a dramatic discount in investor confidence in those companies. But I think from where my conversation has been with some of these clients that have been in that position, I think the short-term investors, the hedge funds, they are very nimble. Some of them already took actions. They think this market is overreacting a little bit, so they buy in at the dip. There's the longer-term investors. If you are looking at 10, 15-year horizon, you look at the demographic, you look at GDP growth, you look at general trend of family income increase, the regulatory trend is a short-term impact, and some of them don't worry about this too much. But I think somewhere in the middle, there's the private equity companies, there's venture capitalists, there's the institutional investors who get into these platform company as a shareholder in a very early stage. They are the ones suffering the most. For example, SoftBank recently made a statement that they made it very clear they are one of the most aggressive investors in this space, in the global investor community. Think about like their peers in the US. They think the next year or two, they will put a pause on investment into Chinese platform industry, and after that they will reassess. But right now they're just freezing their investment plan in China, and their American counterparts have even a more drastic negative reaction to that. Some of them even say this market is no longer investable. Some of them say I will put a big discount into the market evaluation of stocks going forward.
But just to follow up a bit, but you said on the one hand, some of the investors think that there's been too much the decline's been too strong, and they're investing now.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, others won't invest at all.
Yes, there's definitely the disparity. And some company will say, I will only invest in the politically safe area. That's biotech, that's semiconductors, that's maybe quantum computing related initiative, or that's electric vehicle, autonomous vehicle related investment project, because those are the strategically important industry to the Chinese government. They right now want to shape their platform company, direct their business plan into these hard tech areas. In some way, they want them to be more like Google and Facebook and Amazon and Apple, who have these moonshots project and looking at the strategically important technology, not just maximizing their profit on the e-commerce side. That's kind of Chinese government's long-term goal. That's one of them. This is one of their goals. So the investors now, some of them are buying on the dip into this specialized area. And I think longer term there may be some backtrack on that, because if there's too much hot money flowing into these sectors, eventually there will be bubbles. And the Chinese government have sent a signal that they will not wait until the bubble grow too big to burst them. Think about like Tsinghua Unigroup, one of China's national champion in the semiconductor. They haven't been doing very well, and now the government are letting them go bankrupt. The companies paring themselves down. They are going to sell the most valuable assets of the firm. Some of them on the memory side, some of them on the design side. Those are their core competence as a semiconductor firm. They're going to sell them in order to somewhat save the firm as a whole. But the Chinese government are not weighing in, nationalize the firm or buying them out altogether.
Samm, what do you make of what's going on?
Well, I always love being on panels with Xiaomeng because she comes up with the most brilliant analogies. I love the releasing animal.
You're the inspiration.
I think one thing that I will say, and that's a great framing, is oftentimes when we talk about the crackdown going on tech in China, there are distinct threads here and drivers that we need to untangle, and sometimes they're interrelated, and sometimes they are in contradiction, and sometimes they have nothing to do with each other. And I think it's just helpful also to step back and say, what are the different storylines running through, right? So the first one, and Xiaomeng identified, I think, the idea of transferring resources from the internet platforms to the so-called hard tech or real economy. And I think that's an important one. A second one, I think that the Didi example really brought to light something that has been ongoing for at least 5 years, which is data security. And the idea that data is a strategic asset. The Chinese Communist Party announced in April of last year that data is a factor of production. And there's been an ongoing push-pull between the government, the party, and the private sector over centralized management and control of data. So it's not surprising when you think about just a few years ago, actually, Didi got in trouble because it refused to turn over data to police as part of an investigation that was going on when passengers were murdered on the platform, right? And we've also seen Ant in the crosshairs when it comes to personal data and financial credit. The government for a long time has been trying to get access to the data that Ant holds as part of the sort of lack of a consumer credit industry. So I would put data security and sort of centralizing control and creating new mechanisms to facilitate greater data access between government and private sector players. And the third is, I think the party, and Xiaomeng really got at this too, it's the party wants the private sector to deliver on the party's vision for things that are viewed as vulnerabilities in society. So when we look at the crackdown on edtech, for example, the idea of education as a form of mobility in society, but that private edtech companies have been, from a profit perspective, have made this something only accessible to the elite. And I think the government sees this as a source, a sort of a social stability issue. And I would put as well the efforts to stop platforms from forcing merchants into exclusivity, and the sort of long underregulated financial risk that came to light with Ant and Alibaba last fall. So I think we have to think of these as different storylines that are running through, where you have a convergence at times, where, for example, the cyber regulators who have been building out a data protection regime, in the case of Didi, happen to align with the securities regulator in terms of the concerns over foreign extraction of data, which is separate from, antitrust and competition issues, but do converge, I think, in terms of how is the private sector enabling the party vision in these discrete areas.
So let me follow up on a couple of things. When you talked about Didi, you talked about data security, but it seems, if I'm understanding right, there are two issues. One is that the government wanted Didi to know that when the government wants its data, the government gets its data. And then a second part of that was making sure that others outside of the country don't get the data. Is that a second part of that? And then just one more thing on the education aspect. The way you described it, it sounded more like, you were just stating sort of facts, but sort of on a normative sense, it sounded like it was something that they thought was to try to promote equality and make things merit-based. But when we think of education, particularly in that system, we think of trying to teach people particular things. But in this case, it was not about being worried that education companies were teaching things opposed to the party line?
Well, let's talk. So on the Didi question, there was a lot of confusion around this question of what data would be exposed and potentially vulnerable in the process of Didi listing outside of China. Because in the process of it's the data that's sensitive from the Chinese government's perspective would probably be the mapping data, being able to triangulate who takes a ride where, and mapping data and sensitive geographic locations have long been viewed as a national security issue, which is distinct from, say, what data would be disclosed in the financial audit books in the process of public listing. Those are distinct areas. In conversations that I've had with colleagues in China, I think that there is actually a fair amount of confusion about what tools different agencies in the U.S. have in the process of that would expose different types of data. So it's not surprising, for example, that we've seen the Cyberspace Administration of China flexing its muscles in terms of being able to approve overseas listings. But the CSRC has been long sort of managing this issue and potentially, I don't know, to be honest, but I think one of the questions is, did the CAC not get the message about what kind of data would be vulnerable to foreign extraction in the process of public listing? I think there's a lot of confusion around that. On the question of EdTech, so I think that sometimes it's easy to sort of always assume the most kind of nefarious, the party is cracking down for the sake of control narrative in China. And oftentimes that is true. And oftentimes there is also alongside that, a genuine concern around for-profit online education companies being something that was a source of sort of social division and enabling only elites to get their kids certain kinds of advantages. And I think both are probably at play here.
David.
Well, I think the two speakers before me really laid it out. And let me just say how much of a pleasure it is not only to be back here, to be on a panel rather than as moderator. It's a lot easier to be here than up there. I have to think of all the questions. And most importantly, this year, being able to be on a panel means I don't have to wear my mask in this room. So that's really a huge, huge upside. What we're talking about, and one of the things I think of from my perspective that is most interesting is almost none of the things we're really talking about are new. If you read the press, there's a sense that this is all new, that there's somehow a major change happening. And I don't think that's the case. I think we're seeing new elements of a long and old story. When I was in industry in the 1990s, I was executive with a large international telecom company, and the Chinese government wanted us to come in and help them develop it. And we looked very closely at those opportunities. And one of the things which, even back in the 1990s, we recognized is that the Chinese government would have a very hands-off approach. And they would let us come in and let us do what we thought was the right thing to do. And they would say, we really want you to do that because you have all this new technology. We want to learn from you. We want to understand. Let 1,000 blossoms bloom. We'll see how it goes. And looking at other companies who had come in, it was clear that that would be the case, that we would actually have an ability to do things in a much less regulated way than Europe or the United States and other places. However, we looked around and we saw that those companies that were really successful, and by successful meaning they really, using the term inappropriately and too broadly, market power, so that people really saw you as special and very successful. Once you became really successful, which of course is the objective coming into the market, then we realized that all of a sudden we'd be regulated in ways that were not true early on. And that's, I think, very much the sorts of things we're seeing here. We're seeing companies that have been very successful, including, of course, homegrown Chinese companies being very, very successful. And the prism in which this is being viewed is not so much what is good for the country writ large, or even what's good for individual areas of the country, but rather, how does it affect the Chinese Communist Party? Now, sometimes it sounds like I'm being pejorative there, and I'm not at all. It is a different mindset than it is it good for the government as a whole, because the government is not coextensive with the Chinese Communist Party. And I would say that one of the things which is really wonderful in dealing with the Chinese government on all of these things, and in many of the things that I used to deal with them a lot on, is that, yes, there are times where things are very opaque because there are no rules, and we're seeing lots of explicit laws being enacted now and regulations. There's an aspect of that that's very opaque. But ultimately, they're very clear. They will tell you what they are trying to do. President Xi is very clear. And so, for example, my saying the question is really how does it affect the Chinese Communist Party is not my insight. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying what President Xi said, and he says it often. And again, things like the 5-year plans and the industries that were just listed are those coming out from the central government, from the Communist Chinese Party, as they develop their 5-year plan. So what we see here is a very difficult environment for foreign investors and for foreign companies, and a very difficult environment for Chinese investors and Chinese companies. But it's not a mystery, and it's not, in its application may be different today, but it's not fundamentally different than what we have seen over the past 20 plus years.
So it seems at a very high level that the Chinese government and the U.S. government are involved in sort of similar kinds of activities. They're both upset with their big tech, but here it's an antitrust issue. It sounds like from what you're saying it's not at all in China, so it's a different set of it's a different set of institutional interactions. They're not trying to break up their companies, as Xiaomeng says, but they do want them to go in different directions. Yeah. Sort of what don't we here kind of understand? I mean, it's natural for us to try to think of it in the same framework that we think of what's happening to our companies, and what are we sort of not getting, really?
Well, I think a lot of people get a lot of it. I think the only part that sometimes is surprising to me is that people are surprised. I think what you're seeing is the Chinese government are using traditional, if I call it Western tools, competition law issues, privacy. I mean, today, coming out of China's announcement about a new privacy law, the big article in the Wall Street Journal today about that. The other day about competition law and the use of that. Issues about, a whole host of national security related issues. They're developing these areas, but behind that really is in what way? So you have a centralized approach to it rather than, in the United States and in Europe, both a centralized and decentralized. Decentralized being competitors complaining about other competitors, privacy, right. Groups complaining about what companies do and so forth. It's a more, I would say, more focused approach. And in many respects, a more targeted approach. And I guess ultimately, you have these, being very crass about it, you have extraordinarily powerful individuals in China whose have amassed large fortunes, billionaires and so forth, and yet not necessarily up until recently focusing on what's best for the Chinese Communist Party. And this is another way of reminding those people that that's really the focus of what they should be doing.
And I think from the competition perspective, the U.S. government looking at antitrust law, how to implement them, how do we revise a rule, how do we revise a guideline to make sure it reflects today's reality in the digital age. I think comparatively, Chinese government's approach to antitrust is still very much a developing world way of doing things. Like here in the US, the assessment from FTC of the market power of companies is very much about pricing. There are other elements, but pricing is a big part of the assessment process, and it's the easier, straightforward way to do. There's quantitative measurement to assess companies' market power and their impact on consumer welfare. But if you look at the practice, Chinese platform companies have been performing I think this is the underreported part of the story. We see a lot of reporting about stock price dropping and Chinese government crackdown, but we see less in the US, in the Western media about how Chinese companies have been doing, what's their market practice in this area. Like the typical practice, number one, that has been the main target of China's antitrust campaign is what they call pick one from two. So during the national sales event in November, a big rivalry between Tencent and Alibaba's e-commerce platform will kill each other to get more suppliers on their side, to the extent that they block a supplier from their website if you work with a rivalry group. This way, they try to get more power and get more market buy. Like last year, I think during that 1 week online sales event, Alibaba generates something like over $70 billion, and Tencent side is probably similar to that number. You can see their pressure is very high in terms of competing with the rivalry. It's a fierce competition. That's how they act. So since Alibaba got fined by summer, China's antitrust watchdog by $2.8 billion in April, they have toned down this type of behavior. Other e-commerce platforms have done so as well. But the type of behavior, also very aggressive, also has an impact on consumer welfare, is what they call the big data-enabled pricing scheme. They give you different prices based on your behavior pattern. If you keep buying the same airplanes, the same hotel rooms, the same tours, the same lunchbox over and over again, your price will be higher. The price will rise incrementally compared to the first-time user. And then also, if you are a high-end iPhone user for the same product, same service, same time, same location, you search for the same type of product compared to a lower-end Android user, the lower-end phone user will get a much better price. That's how they exploit the power of big data to get an advantage over their consumers, because consumers don't know this type of knowledge. They don't have this data transparency. They don't have any visibility into what's in the algorithm. That's why the big tech can take advantage into this asymmetrical situation in the marketplace. And even after Alibaba got fined for that record antitrust penalty, this type of behavior still exists in the market. Like,
let me sorry to interrupt for a second and ask. So the problem the government had with it was what it meant for prices for particular consumers. So it had a problem specifically with price discrimination. It was not about how it affected other firms' entry into the market.
It's initially when the campaign first started, their rhetoric about this, both of them. But once the implementation kicks in, there's only focus about the first type, not the second. That's why even we are 4 months, 5 months into the antitrust campaign, the latter practice still exists.
Does China have an official policy on price discrimination? Because in theory, that economic theory is it could be good or bad for consumers, right? So, it sounds like they've decided it's always bad.
Well, what's the good case?
The good case is that you can sell something at a higher price to people who value it more, and that allows somebody to charge a lower price for the same product for people who value it less.
If there's transparency, right?
No, not necessarily.
Yeah. But I think the point here is that it creates potential social instability as people start to realize
that's what I'm asking. So they've decided that they do not. That it's not. From their perspective, it's not good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's their decision. Because some of the consumers pay for VIP membership and they got charged more. Is that a good thing?
Right. Not if you're a VIP member.
Right. Right. That's an interesting sort of VIP.
And for a sec, because I think there's I love David's point about the way that we're seeing some Western tools used in China. And I think that there's a broader convergence that's happening in China, the US, and even Europe when we look at some of these tools that are on the table. And the other area of some convergence has to do with data sharing and data portability. And the data portability mandates that have been proposed, I think not only on the US side, I think not only have echoes in terms of Europe and DMA, but also in China, there have notoriously been these data silos or islands in terms of both within the Chinese government political bureaucracy around access to government data, and also private sector data. And so we're seeing a number of new mechanisms that are set up to kind of force different actors, both public and private, to open up and share their data, whether it's data markets, whether it's in new sort of vaguely worded provisions in the data security law, the personal information protection law. This is an area where I think is underexplored in terms of the interaction between Europe, China, and the US, and the government government tools that are used to promote greater data sharing and operability, and then what the ripple effects are, what the knock-on effects are.
Follow up on that?
Okay.
Okay.
No.
So, Xiaomeng, I wanted to follow up on one thing also. You mentioned this just briefly, but you said that one of the Chinese government's long-term goals is to make their companies more like the US companies.
Yeah.
But also at the same time, they want them to be aligned with party objectives. How do those two things go together?
Yeah, they have like a long list of things they want their tech champions to do. It's align strategically, align politically, don't cause any financial risk, provide some social safety net to their poor workers, and maybe even support digital Silk Road overseas. Some of those goals are inherently conflicting internally. I don't think they will get everything, but right now the antitrust pressure, data security pressure, it's so high. They're trying to shape the business role in the society. They will try to squeeze as much as they can without breaking them up.
David, one of the things you've said a couple times is that you're surprised that people are surprised. And we know that China takes a very long view on this. What would you expect them to do now?
Well, I think, again, I just will repeat what they say they plan to do. Two things come to mind immediately. One is they will focus a lot of attention on what they refer to as core technologies. And Xiaomeng already listed a bunch of them, including things like semiconductors, quantum computing, things of that nature. Similarly, what they will do is they're going to invest a lot of money, government money, in R&D as a way of trying to get ahead in the competition, international competition in these important spaces. It's interesting to me, going back on the core technologies, semiconductors often is one of the key areas, and it's always interesting how difficult that has turned out to be for Chinese companies and therefore for the Chinese government to actually become a leader in that area rather than otherwise. And things like the Huawei issues and so forth really underscore how dependent they have been on the newest generations semiconductors coming out of the United States, Taiwan, Europe. So one is that. The second part I think you'll see, and this is sort of a second part of the tension we're talking about, is trade obviously continues to be a major focus. And although the press seems to report a lot on the continuing tensions and the problems, which certainly is true, if you read the Chinese press, and I read the English translations of it, I quickly add, they are clearly trying to find a way to do some confidence-building measures with the U.S. to try to get that back on track. And by back on track, it's a little bit complicated because actually the amount of trade between the United States and China is at record levels. You wouldn't think that based on the rhetoric, but the amount of trade is extraordinary. The amount of the trade deficit also continues to be very, very large, despite the agreement that was reached in 2020. So I think what we'll see is some very interesting opportunities here. I think there's indications that Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen will be going to China. There's a hope that she'll go.
I thought only Nixon could go.
I'm sorry?
I thought only Nixon could go to China.
Yeah, right. Well, he was the second after Kissinger, I guess, right? And so we'll see how that plays out, where the Chinese government is focusing a lot of attention on people like Jake Sullivan and Secretary Blinken as being the evil ones. And interestingly, that Janet Yellen is the voice of reason, maybe in part because she talked about in an interview not too long ago that the tariffs were actually hurting U.S. consumers, which of course is something that the Chinese government has believed in a long time.
So this question, this is a question that I don't know how to answer this. It's a question what is the right framework for thinking about China and the U.S.? Not specifically about tech, but China does a lot of terrible things, right? A lot of the opposition to it, seems like a mix of, jingoism from the U.S. and old-fashioned protectionism, but there are real things that China does badly. Are we supposed to just ignore what happens to the Uyghurs, for example, re-education camps? What's the right way to engage? How do we think about this? There's the economic side, where we are very heavily reliant on China, and we benefit a lot. But then there are these other aspects of it that we sort of package aside and don't deal with. And I don't know how to put those two things together. I mean, I struggle with it myself. I don't know what to think about it. We're supposed to always oppose these kinds of terrible things, but we just ignore it. Well, how do we, what's in the real world, how do we deal with this and think about it?
I think building coalition is one way to deal with it. If it's just Japan complain about it, Australia complain about it, US complain about it, China can brush it away more easily than, say, recently US and the NATO allies jointly issued the attribution of China's cyber intrusion. It's a very serious case, large scale, very high visibility. I think this type of coordination is a good sign that we didn't see this type of alignment during the Trump administration. Trump liked to go along and punch hard, but recently there's a sign of more joint effort together with other like-minded allies, whether that's on the cyber front or on the human rights front, or the newly established Tech and Trade Council between European countries and the US. I think there's some hope that that new coalition will deliver some real pressure on China. And I think they're having a meeting next month, and that TTC will cover a range of very interesting and important tech issues, from semiconductors to data protection and human rights supply chain security. It's a very wide range of issues, and I think the first US-EU summit happened about a month ago, shows initial enthusiasm and political momentum for this new coalition to move the needle on these things.
I totally agree with Xiaomeng on the point of coalitions, and I would just add to that, when it comes to the Uyghurs, I want to know how in this administration, who is thinking about what is best for the Uyghurs, right? I see a lot of posturing, I see a lot of virtue signaling, there's bipartisan consensus, a lot of chatter in Congress. What's being proposed, a lot of the actions, to me, don't tangibly help the situation for the Uyghurs. So what they do is they do provide some fast tracks to decoupling, for example. So for example, the Forced Uyghur Labor Prevention Act, what it does is it essentially requires any product that's sourced in China to confirm that there was no, if you have a Uyghur employee in your factory, for example, or in the supply chain, it's presumed to be made with forced labor. Now, this sounds like something in theory that we could all get behind. No one wants to have forced Uyghur labor in their supply chain. The problem is, in practice, it's essentially impossible to implement, because even at the same time, we're not allowing third-party audits to be part of that process to verify, basically by saying, well, that's not credible in the first place. And the ripple effect is that auditors are now from both, and the problem is on both sides, obviously. I'm just trying to think of what are tangible, concrete solutions to actually help the Uyghurs that aren't going to have other effects. So auditors now are being harassed in China. They can't even get inside some of these factories. And even if they could, those audits are not being seen as credible. So that's not really working, but it is forcing companies to essentially relocate their supply chains. I want to know, is there a private diplomatic solution where, say, we can go, we have a channel that offers the Chinese government, here's an off-ramp. Close the camps immediately. We will not put in place further sanctions, but you have to close the camps. You can declare victory, say that you won the war on, the war against terrorists, whatever you need to do that's face saving, but close those damn camps. Are those kinds of private diplomatic conversations happening outside of a lot of virtue signaling, which doesn't cost anyone anything, but actually isn't moving the needle to help the Uyghurs?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, on the coalition building piece, which obviously is something that is core to the current administration in ways that was not true for the prior administration, both in terms of the campaign. They talked a lot about putting the coalition of the democracies together with a real China focus, as well as a few other countries like Russia as well. The White House just announced the summit of 4 democracies that will have their first virtual meeting in December. It'll be interesting to see how that gets spun and who shows up for it. But it may well be another vehicle for the sorts of things that we're talking about in terms of coalition building. To me, interestingly, the announcement on the Summit for the Democracies was during the campaign. What the Biden campaign talked about was really with a tech focus, with an issue on economics and anti-China, frankly, focus. This is actually the 3 pillars include things like human rights and very soft civil society related types of things, not the sort of the hard things that they had talked about during the campaign. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. In answer to your question, Scott, my sense is one of the problems we've had with regard to China and our relationship with China is we seem to peak and valley in ways that are, in the long run, probably not sustainable. It wasn't that long ago where there was a consensus that increasing trade, interaction, scientific interactions with universities and everything else was the key to changing China to be more democratic, using that term loosely. It was good for everyone. U.S. consumers were getting less expensive goods, good for inflation, the trajectory. And there was a consensus that that was a good thing. Just a couple of years ago, that consensus has now gone almost 180 degrees the other way. And so there is now, in Washington particularly, and I think across the country, a consensus that relationships with China need to have a radical reform, whether it's issues about human rights with the Uyghurs, whether it's national security issues, Huawei, the whole list here seems to be. It's easy for me to say, and I realize how hard it is, but there's a realistic middle ground. So, and I think we actually live in a lot of that realistic middle ground, we just don't admit it. So as I said before, the amount of trade with China is at record levels, although you wouldn't know that from the rhetoric. The areas of concern are things like national security issues, which is code for the Huawei types of issues and the like, semiconductors, human rights issues like with the Uyghurs and so forth. But that can be done in a much more focused way. And I think my guess is what the Chinese government in Beijing is trying to do is to, and they certainly have said so recently as compared to, let's say, at the beginning of the Biden administration, very much want to see a de-escalation of these types of things along those lines. And we'll see if that can be done. I think actually, interestingly, with the events in Afghanistan, that may make it harder. Now, we're so close to what's just happened and happening in Afghanistan. Right. I'm not here to make any long-term predictions, not even short-term predictions. But there are 2 ramifications that I think may happen. One is the political piece, which is with the debacle of what happened in Kabul and in Afghanistan, there may not be the political capital by the current administration to do new and innovative things like reaching out to the Chinese to try to do something that may not be politically good in the short term. That may be harder for them to do because of all the issues, the political issues. And the second part, going to the Uyghurs, is, of course, because of border issues and so forth, it may well be that the Chinese are going to be much more sensitive about that, having the Taliban literally now next door to them, and the issue about how that will affect minorities and other groups. So it may be, again, time will tell, but it may be that it'll be actually harder for a while rather than easier.
So you've listed lots and lots of different conditions that all push in different directions. But you have been a diplomat, are you generally optimistic that things will move in the right? Not with Afghanistan necessarily. Right. I know we do, but with China, what we're talking about, or
so I am very optimistic about it in the long run, because I think in the long run it is in everyone's collective interest to find a path forward. So I look at that, and frankly, I see optimism with regard to China, as difficult as it is and will be, as compared to things like Russia, where I think it's actually much harder to be optimistic about it long term. But there is so much that we can get appropriately and reasonably from China. There is so much we can give appropriately and reasonably to China in terms of trade, working together. And I'm hopeful that this new realism may be, because again, what's in the long-term interest of the Chinese Communist Party is not the same as what's in the U.S. long-term interest. But that doesn't mean that we can't find sufficient common ground to benefit both sides.
Right. Just want to let people know I'm not ignoring the questions on Slido. We will get to them. Actually, I guess that means I am ignoring them for now, but we will answer them. And so I want to turn back, though, to some questions that are maybe that have easier answers. How are current trends, current activities, things that are happening now, affect this trend towards decoupling? Are we moving? I mean, this is what the panel originally was about. Are we sort of separating and beginning to develop our own technologies, and what are the implications? But I want to start with that with Samm, because Samm pointed out decoupling is one of those words that gets thrown around and without really any definition. So that would be great. Start with that.
Sure, and I want to just do a shameless plug. Our program at Digi China published last year a map where we actually looked at all of the actions that Beijing has taken, all of the actions that Washington has taken, and we broke it down across export and import controls, encryption, supply chain review, trying to unwind scientific collaboration, to sort of really say, there are a lot of discrete actions across these different areas, and here's the picture that's taking shape, and we're going to do an updated version of this in the fall. So I think that just the term, to Scott's point, has been very in vogue, and what does this even mean? I think that particularly what's happening is we're seeing sort of the Chinese government for a long time has restricted in foreign investment across a lot of different sectors, and whether it's biological security or blocking foreign websites. And this is the sort of they did it first argument. Whereas the U.S., I think, has taken a much more sort of hands-off approach and using national security in a pretty narrow way in terms of trying to put up walls around in these issues. But I think that that's changing, and now both sides, from supply chain security to information ICT products and services, the expansion of export controls, are converging around this. The big question for me is, what are the implications of this? And I think there's a need for a sort of real detailed look at the various tools in place and to try to assess what's the impact. So I mentioned, for example, the Forced Uyghur Labor Prevention Act. I think that's one. The other is in the National Defense Authorization Act. There are provisions which would essentially compel American companies that also sell to the government to sell their certain types of covered systems to the U.S. government, to shift production entirely out of China for certain items and that would fall on whether it's electronic components or things that transmit and store information is potentially all encompassing by a deadline of 2023. And then you have very specific kinds of standards and companies needing to put in place different standards in order to sell to China and non-China markets. So I think these are very specific tools for a broad term that gets thrown around a lot. And it will be really important, I think, to look specifically at, okay, if we actually implement this tool, what would the knock-on effect be? And a lot of this is still taking shape. The Commerce Department ICTS, interim final rule on supply chain security, what is the criteria that's going to be used to assess whether a specific transaction poses a national security risk? Easy to get in the weeds, and I'm sorry if I went too down in the weeds on that, but I think we need to take a much more granular lens to looking at what's in play, how's it going to be implemented, and what's the timeline, and what are the specific sort of knock-on effects that would flow from those tools?
Yeah, I think that in this area, I feel the Biden administration has already taken a more measured approach to decoupling, if that's the word here. Like during the Trump administration, there's very, very active push to get Huawei out of 5G networks in Europe, in Latin America, in India, in Africa even, and related to what Samm just said, and now the Biden administration is doing the internal supply chain review process. They have taken several months to be very careful about what's the right approach to this, what's the real risk. They are trying to make a more deliberate process to assess the real risk with a potentially cybersecurity threat that posed by Huawei's equipment. I think that's already took it down a notch a little bit. And also in terms of trying to impact the supply chain and address trade deficit, Trump administration used this big tariff tool. Those tariffs are still in place today, but the Biden administration are not, they couldn't find a way to effectively backtrack from that without looking weak. So, and the premises of their Chinese policy position is that U.S. has to project power from a point of strength. That's why the China cyber policy review has been taking so long. It dragged along much further than the initially proposed timeline. They were supposed to finish by June, July timeframe. They're taking their time to find the right approach to this and find the right timing to announce their major Chinese policy. At the same time, they're trying to get their ducks in a row. I go back to the coalition building effort. They're talking about the Build Back World Better, the B3W effort, as well as some follow-up action on the Blue Dot Network. That's kind of their answer for now from a tactic perspective. But I think this is already a less drastic approach than the Trump administration has been taken. So this will be a more measured decoupling than what we saw a few years back.
Yeah, I think
I totally agree. I think that there's the tendency to say that Biden is continuing the Trump administration approach, and I think rhetorically that's true, and they have left some important tools in place that politically I think the Biden administration cannot walk back. But if you look at implementation, if you look at the executive order that came out in June that rescinded the ban on TikTok and WeChat, what it does is it calls explicitly for using a evidence-based approach, and I think the intent is to do just that, right? If there is a specific transaction, to use an evidence-based approach, so we don't have like what happened with Xiaomeng, where Xiaomeng was put on an investment ban list because of ties to the military, and that was basically thrown out of federal court because the judge said there was no evidence to hold that up. And I think they don't want to get into that same situation again.
Yeah, I have to say, I'm confused by the current administration's approach at a couple of levels. Even though on long term, I think it will get resolved appropriately. But it's interesting, Biden and many others were very critical about the imposition of the tariffs, pointing out that it's U.S. consumers that pay the tariffs, and there was this whole rhetoric between Trump and Democrats about that. And then, so one might have expected that the review would be quicker and that there would be some measures early on that would have been sort of to send signals to the Chinese that there was opportunities for improvement. Instead, what we have is this long process that's taking longer than expected. In terms of the tariffs, not only do we not have them roll back in any fashion yet, and recognizing the political issues associated with that, but there are now all these reports about the exemptions that actually the Trump administration have been very aggressive to use to allow certain importers of Chinese equipment who had no alternative but Chinese equipment to get exempted from those tariffs. Those are being no longer renewed. So actually it's becoming a tougher tariff, ironically, under the current administration than was before. Then on top of that, you see a new Chinese ambassador to the United States. What does he do right out of the box? He's working very closely and reaching out to U.S. industry as a way of trying to underscore why the U.S. industry should put more pressure on the administration in order to start to have revisions to both the tariffing and these trade issues overall. And the U.S. industry, many of these trade organizations, have now become, over the past week or two, much more vocal about the fact that there should be some change. So I think we're in an inflection point. It'll be very interesting to watch. As I said, I don't want to be just all focused on Afghanistan. If not for Afghanistan, I would have predicted that we would see some real shift over the next couple of months. I think the politics of Afghanistan make it more difficult to make it look like we're weaker, perhaps, on these types of issues.
Okay, let me ask a few questions here from the audience. Rick Lane asks, if the Chinese government asks TikTok for its U.S. consumer data, like they did with Didi, can TikTok really say no?
I don't think they asked Didi for their U.S. consumer data.
Okay.
Yeah, because the company has the vast majority of the company's revenue and profit comes from China, like over 90% of that. It has presence in somewhere around like 14, 15 countries outside of the Chinese market, but most of its revenue and profit comes from home country. And I don't think the Chinese government would ask for, because they don't really provide service in the US to begin with, and they don't have service in Canada either, even they have a research center based in the US. So I don't really think the company has much interaction with US
So
data.
if China as an entity could speak, they would say to us, not everything's about you. In this case, they just don't care about us.
I would just add to that, though, that I think TikTok went to great lengths to show that it was segmenting its global data from China. The loophole to this, however, is if their terms of service allow that data to be shared with ByteDance, which is their Chinese parent company. Mm-hmm. So I think that we have, it's that, and I agree with what Xiaomeng is saying. I hear that, but I think we just don't know in terms of the extent to which ByteDance very much does control those operations, even if TikTok has tried to segment its global from its China-based operation.
Yeah, and related to that, one of the things that's just happened is part of their defense against what the U.S. government and Trump administration was trying to do was they made it very clear the Chinese government did not have a role. But it turns out now, just recently, the Chinese government now has an ownership interest and some board seats on one of those parent companies. It's very confusing how it's all organized. But now which is an illustration that the Chinese government is taking very seriously TikTok and ByteDance and the issues associated with that.
A question from Captain America. And this better either be Steve Rogers or Sam Wilson. If it's that other guy, I don't and it's directed to David. What are the trends in the ITU? And will the Chinese and Russians be able to displace Western values generally and specifically in internet governance?
Well, I'm glad we have another 5 hours to talk about this stuff. The short answer is, as everyone I think knows, the current Secretary General of the ITU is a Chinese national, Hu Zhao. Interestingly, his term is up next year. He cannot run for re-election, so he's term limited out. The Russians are running a candidate. Interestingly, the Russian candidate is a former vice minister from Russia who happened to also work for Huawei. So it's a twofer in some respects, according to Captain America. On the other hand, the U.S. is running a candidate. This is where I do my advertisement. Please call your congressman and senator and make sure they are fully supportive of Doreen Bogdan Martin, who is a U.S. national, who will be the first woman elected to be Secretary General of the ITU. She's the current head of the development sector, one of the 5 elected officials, first woman ever to be elected to be one of the 5 senior people there. So, and very impressive for this administration, they, in announcing her, had the Secretary of State, Secretary of Commerce, USTR, all head of Jessica Rosenworcel as acting chair of the SEC, all issue press releases about Doreen's role. So we'll see. There's no doubt the Chinese, well, the Russians particularly are making are not hiding the fact that they would like to see the ITU start to control internet governance in ways we haven't seen before. I think the Chinese and others are a little more cautious. A lot of the action is less at the ITU right now and more at the UN in New York.
Jamie Suskind asks whether we should have security concerns about the digital yuan, and generally skeptical. Should we generally be skeptical of Chinese financial platforms?
I think those are 2 different questions. I
Okay,
think digital yuan is, I think they are at the very beginning of the launch process. They're doing pilots and more pilots. And at the Winter Olympics in Beijing in a few months, they're doing the largest scale launch, supposedly, to make it somewhat operational within the venue. I think it's Chinese citizens that have concern, cybersecurity concern about digital yuan. I think that's one of the barrier for adoption for the digital RMB. I think others being there already very powerful commercial competitors in the marketplace, being Alipay and Tencent Pay, the 2 of them combined together takes somewhere around like a 90% market share. If you have those things, why you want a new platform that you don't know what's the retail application really is, and then you are not sure where the data is going. And to the extent that consumers are sometimes less comfortable about big tech taking their data. Now it's a big brother, it's a government combining that data potentially with maybe their personal ID. And on the security side, the Ministry of Public Security also has its own database. There is a potential for the financial side of the data and the security side of data to get looked in a more holistic way from the government perspective. I think Chinese consumers concerned about that. And then e-payment, I think we are not really at a place for that because that type of application has pretty limited popularity in the US. You don't see the QR code of Alipay, Tencent Pay being used by a lot of US customers right now. I don't think these companies in this political environment will think it's a wise idea to promote their business, given the TikTok, WeChat ban and divestiture executive order. I think at this point they probably stay low. Most of the case used overseas is by Chinese travelers to the extent they can travel overseas and use that payment platform.
We are really out of time, but there's one last question. This is a great question. What one recent book would you recommend to help a non-expert in China understand China?
I think the Jim McGregor wrote a book about 1 billion customers. That's an older version. And then the other guy, Richard McGregor, wrote a book about the Chinese party. I think that's more recent, explain how the government and party interact with each other. That's the one on top of my mind.
Great.
I would say read anything that Peter Hessler's articles from the New Yorker over the past year before he got kicked out of China, or his journalist visa, or not journalist, his visa was not renewed, will give you, I think, a really, just read Peter Hessler. That's all I'll say.
Yeah, totally agree that.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you to the panelists. I thought that was fascinating. Thanks, Samm, for joining us. I'm sorry you're not here. So please join me in thanking them. And everyone else, we'll see you upstairs for lunch in the courtyard.